Well, Ukraine's also facing difficult questions off the battlefield as Donald Trump's return to the White House reignites the debate over a potential negotiated peace. Ukraine's future security is a key sticking point. Moscow says it's open to ceasefire discussions, but also says Kyiv must abandon plans to join NATO. But Ukraine has rejected ending the conflict on terms that would leave it vulnerable to a future Russian invasion.
Ukraine is under growing pressure militarily and politically to discuss a possible end to the war with Russia. Donald Trump's election has put future US support for Kyiv in question. Germany's chancellor's talking to Vladimir Putin again, and Russian forces are making slow but steady battlefield gains. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says any peace deal will have to consider Ukraine's long-term security.
The goal is obvious, to protect against Russian aggression now and to do everything not to lose the post-war peace, to preserve and strengthen our nation, both the state and the people. This is mandatory.
When Zelensky pitched his victory plan to end the war to his closest partners in October, he urged them to issue an immediate invitation to join NATO. A formal invitation has long been on Zelensky's wish list. But in the transatlantic alliance, it has been greeted with resistance from many members. And that means Ukraine needs other options to assure its security if it reaches a peace deal with Russia.
Ukraine will not be going into NATO. There has to be, however, some form of guarantee so that Ukrainians understand that the Russians simply won't start this over next year, and that the certain elements of the West, particularly the US, UK, France, will be ready to stand in should that take place. That means bilateral security guarantees. And I think those are much, much, much more likely than any kind of NATO arrangement.
Ukraine has already entered into bilateral security agreements with 27 of its allies. They pledge long-term support for Ukrainian self-defence by providing assistance to boost Ukraine's military capabilities and shore up Ukraine's economy and governance. But they do not contain any commitments to come to Ukraine's defence with the deployment of armed forces in response to future Russian aggression.
Well, let's bring in Ukraine expert Lesia Ogryzko. She's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and joins us from Kyiv. Welcome to DW. So regardless of the warm words from NATO chief Mark Rutte and Jens Stoltenberg before him, is there any world in which NATO's 32 member states would agree to allow Ukraine to join in the face of a messy peace deal and the suspicion that Vladimir Putin isn't done with Kyiv yet?
Well, first and foremost, I think the short answer is there is really no other security guarantee for Ukraine other than joining NATO. And there is a reason that in the recently presented victory plan by Ukraine's President Zelensky, NATO membership was indeed amongst the priorities. It was listed, in fact, from all the 5 points as number one. Trying to reinvent some sort of other security guarantee is basically self-deception. The only plausible and potential other guarantee would be a nuclear one. However, I have to remind everybody that Ukraine was unfortunately forced in 1994 to give up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal in exchange of nothing. In exchange of nothing, as we've seen back in 2014 and now in 2022 up until now. So what indeed needs to be done in the first place by Ukraine's Western allies is to grant an invitation. Now, as recent history shows us from the cases of Sweden and Finland, even an invitation does not mean an immediate accession to the alliance. And this leaves us with a sort of limbo in the interim, which can be filled
I'd just like to
other...
interrupt you there, because we've sort of got that from the Ukraine side. Let's deal with reality. Ukraine says it wants this invitation. NATO says you will be welcome in due course. There is no way that invitation is going to be issued. So let's talk about, while Russia is sort of sitting there breathing down Ukraine's neck. So where does that leave Kyiv?
Well, I would definitely not say that this is definitely not going to happen.
Okay.
I think
But
under
in the case that it
incoming
doesn't,
Trump administration, that is still possible. Now, in the meantime, while Ukraine is indeed waiting, as you clearly mentioned, there are other security, I would say, arrangements, not guarantees. One is, for example, the whole concept of protection by presence, and this means placement of military contingents of the so-called coalition of the willing.
Right.
Let's say at the administrative borderline. You could also place military instructors, conduct military exercises and trainings on the territory of Ukraine, all sorts of maritime vessel operations, something that the United Kingdom, by the way, was doing pre-invasion back in 2021.
Okay, so there are other options, like actually bilateral arrangements where NATO members might decide to put their troops, their assets in and around Ukraine. It's easy to see how Ukraine would benefit from NATO membership. But what's the Ukrainian pitch to NATO? How would this, we can call it a fire insurance club, benefit from admitting a member whose house looks like it might go up in flames at any moment?
Well, I would say Ukraine's invitation to NATO is precisely about ending this war as soon as possible and preventing from a new one from happening. Because if we're talking about this whole notion of, negotiations and putting Ukraine under pressure to sit at the negotiation table, we are definitely not looking into the perspective of a sustainable peace. The only real guarantee for both Ukraine and the transatlantic security space would be for Ukraine to join NATO. Because Ukraine's membership in NATO is sort of the fastest and the strongest signal to Russian elites and to the Russian society that Ukraine will never be part of the Russian Empire. NATO is by this way a territorial, a geopolitical marker that this territory will not be part of the empire and of all of the other alliances that Russia is trying to create on the territory of the post-Soviet countries.
Understood.
And so the continuation of any other special operation simply loses any meaning.
Thank you for taking us through that so clearly. Lesia Ogryzko from the European Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you.
Well, for more on this, we can talk now to Fabrice Pothier. He's a political consultant and former NATO strategic policy planner. Fabrice, Ukraine desperately wants to join NATO, and NATO did declare in 2008 that Ukraine will become a member. Is that even a remote possibility anymore?
I think it's clearly among most of the commentators, but also decision makers, has become the NATO membership the one and only solution to properly finish this war and give Ukraine the kind of guarantees it has always liked and the kind of guarantees where they will know that Russia will not be able to invade the same way it has done already twice in 2014 and 2022. So I won't speculate on whether it's going to happen tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, but I think the strategic case for NATO membership has never been stronger.
But we're looking at a scenario right now where we may be having negotiations, trying to negotiate a peace in Ukraine. Is NATO membership for Ukraine something that Russia would be willing to accept?
Well, I think we have to stop thinking what Russia will be willing, unwilling, will escalate, not escalate. We have to think about what is our interest and what is Ukraine's interest here. And Ukraine's interest and our interest is that you have a sovereign and independent Ukraine that can strive in the next decades and centuries and be a member of the European Union. And for that, you need to have guarantees, assurances that Ukraine will be able to defend itself and that they will have also allies to help them defend themselves against a possible threat from the East. So I think this is where it really matters. And yes, obviously, Vladimir Putin, for him, NATO membership is a thick red line, but we have also crossed many of his thick red line. And this is where what's happening now, the fact that it is very fluid, you can see many signaling happening from Washington, from Kyiv, from Moscow. It's important we signal strengths and commitment. And key to that commitment is NATO membership.
So it can't be said when or even if Ukraine will get NATO membership, but what it wants in some form are long-term security guarantees. Those would be provided, I suppose, if it were to get them, from its current allies. How likely is it that we'll see those guarantees in some form, and what would they look like?
Well, we have contributed to put together this bilateral security guarantees in 27. I think in history it has never been done, and we are proud to have been working with President Zelensky and his team in putting together the Kyiv Security Compact, which now has become the Ukraine Compact. But let me tell you one thing. I think what is clear is that the Ukrainians will have to make some hard compromises. They will have to accept some sacrifice. They have already accepted huge sacrifices. But to make these compromises possible politically and in terms of future of Ukraine, they need from us this ironclad guarantee that they won't be invaded again. And if they are invaded, they will have the means to push back. This is where this membership question of very robust security guarantees is key. And let me finish here. Security guarantees, ad hoc security guarantees of the kind of NATO will be extremely expensive compared to NATO security guarantees, because NATO already has a framework, already has means and contingency plans. So there's already an investment done. As if we do it outside NATO, I warn Berlin and Washington, it will come with a very big check.
Again, we come back to the question of some sort of negotiated end to this war. What kind of security guarantees for Ukraine could be accepted by Russia, realistically?
I think if we start like this, nothing will be accepted by Russia, because Putin's plan in Ukraine is not to have a sovereign Ukraine, not to have a Ukraine that has agency over its own future. So I think if you start from Putin's point of view, you end in a kind of the absence of Ukraine as an independent nation and state. So I won't start here. I think is what is realistic, what is possible. And if you look at West Germany, which joined actually NATO in 1955, even though it did not have yet political unity. And yes, there was no war happening between West and East Germany, but there was no political unity of Germany as a whole. And yet Adenauer made that decision that he will fix, to say so, political unity later, but he will focus first on security of West Germany. And this is why he joined NATO. And I think this is a kind of similar scenario we're facing in Ukraine.
Fabrice, thank you very much. That was Fabrice Pothier, former NATO strategic policy planner. Thank you.
Bye.